Hello everyone, this is a call, and what I want to talk about today is I'm going to talk about the ninth house in Sagittarius. So, the ninth house in Sagittarius are ruled by Jupiter. Now, this is pretty important because when I think about the sort of the ultimate outcome of the path of a Sagittarius native, what I tend to think of is teacher. I don't mean sort of like, elementary school teacher or, sort of common sense, everyday kind of knowledge. What I'm talking about here is much more sort of expansive knowledge. This is higher education, higher learning. So, with that association with the ninth house, one of the things we also have to now consider is we have to consider the maturity level, or where along their progression is the Sagittarius individual. Or again, if you have planets in the ninth house, how mature are those planets and how are they mature? Now, what generally dictates how mature something is doesn't have to do with age. What it has to do with is, again, this is kind of my own perception, my own definition of it. It has to do with your ability to grow. It has to do with your ability to look at areas that were failures or areas that didn't turn out the way you wanted them to, or events in life or relationships or whatever it is, and being able to reflect back on that and to learn and to see where you grew. If you can't do that, then it's like your growth is stunted. And then even though you may be a 70-year-old person, you actually, may have the maturity level of like a 30-year-old. I mean, that's one way to look at it. So, and that's how I'm going to perceive it for this video and how I'm going to explain it to you. So, immature Sagittarius, first off, is that this is very restless energy, right? This is fire and it's changeable, right? So, a lot of activity, fire, and it's moving to this, to that, and it's kind of bouncing around a lot of different ways. Now, the purpose of this bouncing around and trying this and trying that, and again, this is very excitable energy, very enthusiastic energy. Now, the reason for all this, though, is to gain life experience. And as they gain life experience, what ends up happening is that this energy begins to channel in a much more precise kind of way. Now, one of the things about this energy, though, is as they're bouncing around, one way to kind of look at it is it's like the jungle. Now, how do you get out of the jungle, which is thick and dense and there's a lot of weird critters and you get lost in the jungle? How do you get out? Well, you have to find a path. Now, this path becomes illuminated as these individuals start to access this idea of higher learning or the application of the higher mind to mundane things. Now, one of the ways that this can happen, again, as I mentioned, education. So, immature Sagittarius may anchor into all sorts of beliefs. They may form all sorts of opinions because they've studied religion or they've studied philosophy or whatever it is that they've studied. And the idea is that they're bringing in all this intellectual content because immature Sagittarius functions a little bit like Gemini. And what do I mean by that? I mean is Gemini is, ruled by Mercury. It's air and it's intellectual. So its ability to discern between this and that. So it gains information and knowledge in order to get a better idea of what to discern. So, and again, eventually, even with Gemini, the idea is synthesis. It's how do I bring these polarities into synthesis. So that's Sagittarius as well. But of course it's different. It's a little bit different. And so there's a whole lot of high-mindedness here. And one of the pitfalls of immature Sagittarius is that they get these opinions, right? So very strong opinions. And they'll try to convince you they're right. And they're going to try to convert you over to their side, so to speak. Now, this sort of thing is flawed because, one, it'll build resistance and it could be argumentative. But one of the things about Sagittarius, though, is there's also a certain lightness about Sagittarius because it's mutable. So it won't fix too much on a particular perspective, although that's not entirely true. They could become very fixated on a particular perspective. So they need to access that levity, that lightness that comes along with this sign. This is very light energy in a lot of ways. And so that light energy allows them to change course when needed, if they can see where they're anchored in. Because the deeper they anchor into a particular perception, and I'm going to have to say this a little bit differently, because it's not necessarily about anchoring into a particular perception or idea or belief. It's about they're not anchored into the ultimate. They're not anchored into their soul, right? So because the soul of Sagittarius or mature Sagittarius, they're leading them to a special place. And that special place is the earth. So the soul of Sagittarius is very much about the earth. And why the earth? Well, the earth is where Sagittarius gets their grounding. Again, this is very abundant energy. It's very movable energy. And so if they can ground it, they have to ground it into something solid, though. And so that brings up this idea of what can we anchor into? If you're anchoring it into the intellect, or let's say man's law, things that man has created, so structures that man has created, philosophies and beliefs, and all these different things that man has created, and man, we create all sorts of things, but it's never the same as what the universe has created, or God, or whatever we want to call it. It's always just kind of like a reasonable facsimile of the original. Another way to look at it is we'll say this is the material plane, and this is man's beliefs. So this man's beliefs. But the problem with man's beliefs is that they change. They're always changing. They're always shifting. They're transient in nature. They are temporary, right? So if you're going to anchor deeply into that, it's a bit like trying to put your feet onto something. You try to step onto something, but there's no floor, so you just simply fall. So the idea here is that there's nothing solid to put your feet on, because these ideas, that's all they are, is they're ideas. And Sagittarius is at that point in the evolution of the zodiac where they're here to realize what spirit is ultimately leading them towards. And so because Sagittarius represents the first phase of this evolution into spirit, which is continued through Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, this energy has to find a grounding first. And that grounding comes from nature. So Sagittarius individuals are here to align with natural law. They're here to align with earth, air, fire, water, animals, plants, sunrise, sunset, lunar cycles, seasonal cycles. Think about that which is natural. That's what Sagittarius is here to align with. And again, if you have a lot of planets in the 9th house, you're going to see very similar kind of a dynamic, is that all this high-mindedness that comes from that particular house, all this wanting to go into higher education, to become professors, and And again, a lot of the purposes in let me back that up. A lot of individuals who have planets in the 9th house, they may also cultivate this tendency to want to argue and debate. Now, the purpose of arguing and debate isn't necessarily to come out on top, although that's what we think sometimes. The reality is that argument and debate, even if it doesn't turn out well, really what it's here to do is, and I've heard a lot of people say this before, and I've said it myself, which is sometimes you have to say something out loud. So you say it out loud, you express it to your therapist, you express it to whoever, just so you can kind of hear yourself. Because when you can hear yourself, you're like, oh, hey, it becomes objective, right? Right? So once you can see your ideas objectively, you realize you are not them. Sagittarius is learning to identify who they are, their ego, their personality. And again, we're talking about Sagittarius ascendant, the moon, the sun. That's where you're going to get the most prominent aspects of this energy. If that energy doesn't realize that what they're identifying with as who they are is this temporal, flimsy reality that man has created, then there's always going to be this restlessness, and there's no peace, right? There's no peace. It's going to be constant movement and activity and going from one thing to the next and everything else. So through something very special, which every human has the ability to access this very special thing. And this very special thing brings you into connection with the human being's connection to nature. And that is intuition. Intuition is the pathway for the human being to recognize that I too am nature. Because intuition isn't a matter of this or that. It's not about discerning. It's not about thought. It's not about the intellect. It is the point of synthesis that Sagittarius, as they mature, is moving towards. It needs to find points of synthesis. They start to honor their intuition. They're honoring spirit, the universe, as it flows through them. In the case of Sagittarius, it's about the wisdom that is gained in teaching it and expressing it out on the material plane. So that's why the soul of Sagittarius is nature. The soul of Sagittarius is the earth. So something else I should also say is that there's often an innate, there's kind of, innate is the right word, I guess. There's an innate feeling of alienation from other human beings sometimes when it comes to Sagittarius. They don't necessarily feel connected to humanity sometimes. And that is one of their evolutionary tools, I would say, that feeling of alienation, that feeling of not quite belonging, etc. And that is because they're here to recognize in humanity that which is universal, in the sense of your nature, I am nature. You get caught up in the ideas and the personalities, you go back into the jungle. You go back into confusion and chaos. So the pathway out, once again, is the intuition. Now, how is intuition also incredibly handy? Because intuition connects you and aligns you not only with nature, which is the bigger picture, of course, here, but something else to really kind of consider here is when you connect to nature, you put your feet on the planet, you start to honor the deeper vibe of what's correct. When your intuition says something is good for you, you follow it, and I guarantee it is, right? So once you have your feet firmly on the ground, you start to honor the intuition, you get out of your head, something magical happens. So most of us, our center of gravity, so to speak, is here. It's kind of the intellect, it's our identity, it's all these things that we identify as. You know, we identify as our sexuality, we identify as our gender and our color and all this stuff, whatever. The reality is that all the identity stuff only divides and separates the individual and breaks us and compartmentalizes us, right? It's caustic. The fact that we have political systems that are obsessed with identity is caustic, because all it does is divide. So the individual has to determine what's truly important. Am I going to get caught up in politics, or I get caught up in the work situation? You may be very high-minded about these things, but the reality is that there's no anchor there. Once again, these are all fallible institutions. But what is infallible? Sunrise, sunset, lunar cycle, seasonal cycles, etc. Putting your feet on the planet, right? That which is solid beneath you is infallible. That is natural law. So once you kind of connect with natural law, you connect to intuition. It does something that's incredibly magical. It connects you to the energy of life. It connects you to power as it moves through you. So you have all this enthusiasm that is now channeled down a path. You get out of the jungle, you can teach everyone what you've experienced and what you've learned. And that's where Sagittarius really, really starts to bloom and starts to blossom, and life becomes joyous and effortless for these individuals if they can access the energy of the form. I believe it was Yogi Bhajan. He said, the body is life, and life has nothing to offer but flow. I mean, think about that moment. Yogi Bhajan said, the body is life, and life has nothing to offer but flow. So significant, because the energy and the momentum of life actually flows from within to out. We shine from the inside out. We're conditioned to function from outside in, right? We become alienated from our emotions. alienated from our intuition, alienated from our instincts, alienated from our animal, our nature. And Sagittarius is here to flip that around, turn it around, and to learn how to shine from the inside out once again. So that Jupiter energy, in the end, it is guru. And when I get to Pisces, Pisces has a lot of Jupiter too, as well as Aquarius, surprisingly. And this Jupiter energy plays differently. And when I do the video on the 12th house in Pisces, I'll go into that a little bit. But again, just keep in mind that the ultimate, I would say, outcome of mature Sagittarius is to become that spiritual teacher. And ultimately to, I guess, understand that the word truth, it's self-evident, right? It's not opinion, and truth is not it's not a relative thing. It is that which lies within nature itself. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I appreciate you watching, and if you have any interest in chart reading, chart interpretation, whatever you want to call it, astrological counseling, blah blah blah, if you have any interest, my website is down below the video. Feel free to reach out, and on my website you will find my email, which is my preferred way of being in contact. So thank you much.